On my page, you'll hear this usual language being used pertaining to the individual, or to my dear reader. Now, all of this language, which is insistent as to the individual, is something of an indirect homage I'm paying to the thought of Soren Kierkegaard, who was the first before me to use phrases like, my dear reader, solitary individual, and so on. However, its overall point is to highlight the kind of individual who has come to a certain maturation of consciousness, whereby they are able to say, I am, or I exist. Now, of course, to make that claim might sound something like a strange thing to say, especially when it's something that falls upon particularly modern ears. But it radically emphasizes the difference between the individual and the masses, between the self and the crowd. Hence, the reason I bring together Soren Kierkegaard and Carl Jung, one person being a philosopher, the other being a psychologist, is to call in mind that they both recognize the kind of impersonal forces that pose as a threat to man's own self-understanding and individuation, to his own authenticity and selfhood. As Carl Jung notes, the sort of rift that has been caused throughout the modern world to radically pit the self against the crowd, even be it the individual against the state, is one which permeates even the highest reaches of religion. It is time we asked ourselves, writes Jung, exactly what we are lumping together in mass organizations, and what constitutes the nature of the individual human being, i.e., of the real man, and not the statistical man. This is hardly possible except by a new process of self-reflection. Now, contrastedly, I think Kierkegaard would have agreed that the way in which we transcend or overcome this leveling process of our being smoothed out from our individuality, dissolving into that of the crowd, is to invite an altogether new kind of self-reflection. However, the kind of self-reflection Kierkegaard is explicitly mentioning is a religious reflection, or it's one which is directed explicitly towards the religious. Kierkegaard otherwise recommends against a kind of reflection which is only directed towards abstraction, since this is a further temptation of the individual to fall into the grasp of an intellectual elite, an academic elect, if you will, even though at this level of superfluity or other thoughts of pride, these may never actually enter into this reflective individual's mind. But for Kierkegaard, reflection doesn't mean an intellectual use of faculties. Rather, Kierkegaard is referring to the tendency to feel one's reality reflected in something external to oneself, although it's not specifically reflected in another person, as we find in love or in religion. But this reflection is something instead in some collective organization, some impersonal force like the mob, crowds, masses, institutions, and the like. The collective organization, as both Jung and Kierkegaard agree, is chaotic. It's unordered. According to Jung specifically, the actions of the crowd all end in mutual frustration, and they are further impelled, quote, in a definite direction by a dictatorial will. Now, as a post-World War II psychologist, or at least writing at this time, in a specific essay that I'm referring to called The Undiscovered Self, even though in German it was initially translated as present and future, we English speakers know this text as The Undiscovered Self, which I believe was written in 1956. But in this specific essay, in this post-World War II circumstance, Jung is beginning to see the importance of suggesting that the individual needs a directing and ordering principle, which is succinct from the movements of the crowd. Now, Christianity might very well supply these seeds of growth so required for authentic self-individuation. After all, in contrast, there was a more Marxist mode of education, which seeks, as Jung said, like God himself, to remake man, but in the image of the state. Hence, the horrors of communism so achieved throughout the earlier part of the 20th century were in Jung's mind inadequately addressed from the prevailing religious attitudes of the day. But this is no fault to Christianity as such, says Jung. But it's more so due to our interpretation of Christianity that is instead to be credited the fault. Jung writes, "The Christian symbol is a living thing that carries in itself the seeds of further development. It can go on developing. It depends only on us, whether we can make up our minds to meditate again and more thoroughly on the Christian premises." Now, of course, we could very much compare this account with a sort of background of salvation and grace, the kind of intentional act on part of the Father that seems to be altogether missing in Jung's account. But I don't think that's kind of what we're intended to do here as Christians, although that difference, that line in the sand may be drawn. I think to turn the page here for a moment and go into Kierkegaard's configuration of the problem, which now I'll borrow as a kind of uniquely Christian standpoint to highlight this issue. We see a similar element in Kierkegaard of a sobering psychology that attempts to philosophically and theologically clarify the solitary individual and what has otherwise been called by philosophers as the subjectivist dialectic. Now, historically speaking, it was in the 2-year period between 1846 and 1848 that Kierkegaard was himself immersed in politically tumultuous territory, especially given his collision with the Danish newspaper The Corsair in 1847, or for those of us otherwise who know this debacle as the Corsair Affair. Now, it was in that 2-year period that Kierkegaard garnered the sort of sufficient spiritual fuel to engage in his all-out frontal attack upon Christendom, what he otherwise considered to be an impersonal, distant, vague notion of an all-too-human version of Christianity. Critics of religion, freethinkers, and skeptics were only really a marginal threat to Christianity, said Kierkegaard. It was instead those clergymen and priests who preached the absolute seriousness of eternity, all the while outright denying it through their actions. At least the freethinkers and skeptics were honest in their proclamations. It were those adherents within Christendom who have instead made a mockery out of God, according to their lives, which now instead is to be credited the true fault. What we have come to see otherwise in this present age is an arrival upon the world stage of meaninglessness, neurosis, and anxiety. To only have called forth upon the psychiatrist, who, as Jung says, is summoned willy-nilly to appear, and questions are addressed to him which primarily concern the most intimate and hidden life of the individual, but which in the last analysis are the direct effects of the Zeitgeist, or what means in German, the spirit of the age. So more concretely, this principle of individuation is important for religion because it radically emphasizes the need to cross the threshold of consciousness in order to expunge those unconscious forces which hinder or obscure this process of self-development. And as Jung says very commonly, which is seen in his psychiatric process, that the kind of emotional drive which is pitted against these unconscious forces are commonly known as fear. So, right, we are afraid to approach these shadows of ourselves. And so it is my contention that not only religion as such, but more specifically does Christianity contain the key for total self-individuation, since it is the only worldview which allows for the individual self to be integrated as a reconciled self before God. The Christian religion is the only means by which the I-thou dynamic is authentically expressed, precisely because it was only made possible by the atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. Now, Kierkegaard understood Christ as the prototype of our faith, where Jung made a particular phrase about Christ understanding him more so as a symbol of the self. More specifically, the self-individuation, according to Jung, for this particular man, Jesus Christ, right, who we otherwise known as the Son of Man, that this self-individuation is precisely the mode of incarnation and revelation that God uses for himself. Or at least, that this particular man is what contains all of the religious content for Christianity's symbolism, for individuation. Now, perhaps, of course, in another video we'll address more details concerning Jung's and Kierkegaard's Christological views, as interesting, of course, as that may be. But I think I just want to leave that Pandora's box closed for now, and instead provide the summarizing point to show that Christianity distinguishes itself from other world religions by not appealing to the approximate, general, confused, albeit mythological configurations of the transcendent. But Christianity alone instead appeals to a historical instance, namely that God became man. Now, wound up, of course, with this symbol of the self, Jesus Christ, also comprises this sign of our faith, which is intimately wound up with it, namely the cross. The cross is a sign precisely because it points us elsewhere, the reality of which in itself stands as an offense to the natural mind, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1. It is a sign which initially makes its impression from within to without. It creates a need for a holy debasement that starts within the inauthentic self, transfiguring it, and eventually elevates it towards an indirect participation in the very life of the prototype, the God-man himself, Jesus Christ.